She was never meant to be a queen, let alone the most powerful woman in Europe. Born in a drafty manor in northern Germany, young Sophie was just another noble daughter in a world that expected little of her. Her family had titles but not wealth, connections but not real influence. Her father, a quiet military man, spent his days chasing honor. Her mother, sharp-tongued and restless, dreamed of marrying Sophie off to anyone, who could elevate their family's standing. But even as a child, Sophie wasn't content with letting life decide her fate. She was hungry for more, not jewels or gowns, but knowledge. While other girls practiced curtsies, she memorized history books and studied languages late into the night by candlelight. She had a knack for reading people, too. In court, she watched how power moved, not by force, but by charm, timing, and silence. She didn't just want a crown. She wanted to understand how the game was played. So when word arrived that the Russian Empress was seeking a bride for her heir, Sophie didn't blink. At just 14, she packed her things, left everything familiar behind, and crossed frozen rivers and foreign borders to enter the strange, wintry empire of Russia. She wasn't Russian, she wasn't powerful, but she had one thing no one expected: a plan. By the time her carriage crossed the Russian border, Sophie had left more than her homeland behind. She had left her language, her religion, even her name. From this point forward, she would be called Catherine Alexeyevna, and nothing about her life would ever be the same. Russia was not what she had imagined. The cold wasn't just in the air, it seemed carved into the walls of the Winter Palace. The court was grand but tense, like a theater set built on ice. Every glance was calculated, every whisper a warning. To survive here, let alone thrive. Catherine understood one thing immediately: she would need to become someone entirely new. At just 14, she was thrown into a world of strict rituals, unfamiliar customs, and a language she barely understood. But she didn't flinch. She learned Russian faster than anyone expected, reading by candlelight, practicing accents in the mirror, reciting grammar during meals when tutors weren't around. She asked maids and guards to correct her pronunciation. It wasn't just about speaking the language, it was about erasing the foreignness from her presence. Conversion to the Russian Orthodox faith was the next step. In a ceremony heavy with incense and tradition, she stood beneath gold-plated icons and swore loyalty to a god she had only recently met. Her name was changed officially to Catherine, and though her face remained the same, the girl who arrived from Germany was gone. What remained was a young woman who would stop at nothing to survive the Russian court. And then there was Peter. Her fiancé and soon-to-be husband was the nephew of Empress Elizabeth and the presumed heir to the throne. Catherine had imagined him as a noble young prince, perhaps stiff or awkward, but at least dignified. Instead, she was met with a boy in a man's uniform, obsessed with toy soldiers and military parades, with little interest in governance and even less interest in her. Peter was moody and immature. He often mimicked the Prussian military, his homeland, and made little effort to understand the country he was meant to rule. He dismissed Russian customs, insulted their Orthodox faith, and laughed at superstitions the people still held dear. To Catherine, it became painfully clear Peter was a liability not only to her future, but to the future of Russia itself. Their marriage was strained from the start. In public, they performed the part holding hands at ceremonies, sitting together at banquets. In private, Peter mocked her seriousness, her reading, even her interest in politics. He drank heavily, disappeared for days, and surrounded himself with foolish sycophants. Catherine, by contrast, remained disciplined. She spent her nights studying Enlightenment philosophy, Montesquieu, Rousseau, and Voltaire, smuggling in French texts whenever she could. She began writing in secret, crafting her own political thoughts, reflecting on the nature of law, justice, and leadership. She imagined a better Russia not ruled by whim or inheritance, but by reason. Too many. She seemed cold, even distant, but that coldness was armor. In a palace filled with spies and shifting alliances, warmth was a vulnerability she couldn't afford. Though isolated from her husband, Catherine slowly gained influence in quieter ways. She treated the servants kindly. She remembered names. She listened more than she spoke. In time, key figures at court, tutors, priests, Even officers in the Imperial Guard began to admire her intelligence and restraint. Her greatest weapon, however, was patience. While Peter paraded his foolishness around court, Catherine waited. She watched, she learned. She saw who wielded real power and who only pretended. She learned which generals were loyal to the Empress and which whispered about change. She kept her circle small and her secrets even smaller. Most importantly, she began to understand the Russian people, not just the aristocrats in the palace, but the peasants who lit candles in cold churches, the soldiers who guarded frozen gates, the women who prayed for their children to survive the winter. Peter would never understand these people, but Catherine intended to rule them someday. And though she wore silks and jewels at court, her thoughts were steel. She would not spend her life as a consort to a fool. One day, she would wear the crown not by marriage, but by right. And when that day came, no one would be able to say she hadn't earned it. By 1762, Catherine had been married for nearly 2 decades, and she had learned one unshakable truth. Her husband, Peter, was not fit to rule. When Empress Elizabeth died that year, Peter officially became Emperor Peter III of Russia, and in a matter of weeks, he began undoing everything the Russian court held sacred. He mocked the Orthodox Church, insulted the nobility, and pulled Russian troops out of a war they were winning just to please his idol, Frederick the Great of Prussia. The military was outraged. The clergy was furious, and Catherine, she stayed quiet, at least on the surface. Behind closed doors, she had already begun crafting her plan. Catherine understood power in a way Peter never would. While he played at being emperor, she was building real alliances carefully, patiently. She didn't shout, she whispered. She didn't demand loyalty, she earned it. Over years, she had gathered a small but fiercely loyal circle: military officers, influential nobles, members of the clergy, and even her personal physician. But the most important figure was a man named Grigory Orlov, a dashing officer in the Imperial Guard and Catherine's lover. Orlov wasn't just handsome. He was trusted by the soldiers who guarded the palace and kept order in St. Petersburg. Through him, Catherine reached the heart of Russian military power. And she didn't stop there. She wrote letters, made promises, and ensured that the men with swords understood one thing: Russia needed a ruler who could be strong but wise, who understood both tradition and change, who loved the nation more than themselves. In other words, Russia needed her. The court was a maze of spies, but Catherine moved through it like a shadow. She said nothing publicly against Peter, but in private, she prepared for the moment he would stumble. She stocked uniforms. She studied the movements of the guard. She knew which generals could be trusted and which ones would need convincing. For every loud mistake Peter made, Catherine laid another brick in the foundation of her rebellion. Then, in late June of 1762, she received word that Peter planned to arrest her. Perhaps he had caught wind of her alliances. Perhaps he simply feared her popularity. Either way, the time for patience had ended. On the morning of June 28th, Catherine rose before dawn, with Orlov at her side. She dressed in military attire and rode to the Izmailovsky regiment barracks. The soldiers, groggy and confused, gathered around her. And then, calmly but firmly, she declared herself the rightful ruler of Russia. They didn't hesitate. One by one, the men dropped to their knees and swore allegiance. Soon, other regiments followed. Priests blessed her in public ceremonies. Nobles raced to pledge loyalty. Crowds lined the streets of St. Petersburg, cheering, not for the emperor but for the empress. Peter, caught completely off guard, panicked. He fled the capital and tried to rally support. But it was too late. Russia had chosen. Within days, he was captured, forced to sign an abdication, and taken into custody. Not long after, he was found dead, killed under mysterious circumstances. Officially, it was reported as natural causes. But in truth, the cause was Catherine's revolution. She never publicly admitted to ordering his death, but she never denied benefiting from it either. What made Catherine's coup so extraordinary wasn't just its success, it was its bloodlessness. No civil war, no mass executions, just a single, strategic move that reshaped the empire. a foreign-born woman had taken the Russian throne without a drop of royal blood and without spilling much herself. In a time when women were expected to sit quietly behind their husbands, Catherine had seized an empire with grace, calculation, and unshakable resolve. But taking the crown was only the beginning. Now, she would have to prove to the world and to history that she deserved it. When the crown was finally on her head, Catherine the Great didn't celebrate with feasts or fireworks. Instead, she went back to work. Taking power was one thing. Keeping it, especially in a land as vast and fractured as Russia, was another. Catherine understood this better than anyone. Her throne was born from a coup, not bloodline. And although the people had cheered her name in the streets of St. Petersburg, loyalty was a fragile thing. She would need more than swords and titles. To keep the empire intact, she would need an idea. In the years that followed her rise, Catherine began to craft a new image, not just for herself, but for Russia. She cast herself not merely as a monarch, but as a philosopher on the throne. She wrote to Europe's greatest thinkers, Voltaire, Diderot, Rousseau, as if they were old friends. In her letters, she spoke of liberty, education, and justice. She positioned herself as the student of Enlightenment ideals and, more than that, as their champion in the East. To the outside world, it worked. European newspapers described her as brilliant, wise, and forward-thinking. Philosophers praised her for bringing light to the cold Russian Empire. She was hailed as a modern monarch, one who could lead with reason rather than force. But at home, the reality was more complicated. Russia in the 1760s was still a deeply feudal society. The vast majority of people known as serfs lived in poverty, tied to the land and to the whims of the nobility. The peasants toiled while aristocrats grew fat. Catherine had long dreamed of reforming this system, but now that she wore the crown, she discovered how deeply entrenched it was. She tried. In 1767, she gathered one of the most ambitious commissions in Russian history, a group of nobles, officials, and scholars tasked with writing a new legal code, fairer, more modern, more humane. She personally drafted a document called the nakaz, or instruction, which laid out her vision. It rejected torture, it supported education. It called for equality under the law, ideas that were radical in Russia at the time. The Enlightenment. Thinkers in Europe were thrilled. They reprinted the nakaz in multiple languages. They wrote essays in her praise. Voltaire, in particular, called her the Star of the North. But the Russian nobility, they weren't impressed. Most saw the reforms as a threat to their power. They dragged their feet. They argued. They left the commission in protest. In the end, the grand legal reform Catherine had dreamed of never came to life. So, she adjusted. Catherine, ever the realist, shelved many of her boldest reforms, but she never abandoned the appearance of reform. She understood that in politics, perception could be as powerful as law. She continued to speak like a philosopher even if she ruled like a monarch. Still, she made real progress in some areas. She expanded education, especially for women. In 1764, she founded the Smolny Institute for Noble Maidens, the first state-funded school for girls in Russia. She funded libraries, built museums, and promoted the arts. Under her reign, St. Petersburg began to resemble a European capital, elegant, cultured, modern. She even opened vaccination programs, decades ahead of their time. When smallpox was devastating Europe, Catherine publicly received the vaccine herself to encourage others to follow, a move that earned admiration both at home and abroad. But even as she pushed culture and medicine forward, she tightened her grip on power. Catherine knew that not every idea from Paris could survive the Russian winter. Her rule walked a tightrope, promising progress while protecting order. Enlightenment thinkers in the West could afford to speak of revolution, but Catherine had seen what chaos looked like. She remembered the Pugachev rebellion, where thousands of peasants had risen up, claiming her dead husband Peter was still alive. That rebellion had nearly torn the empire apart. After that, her tone changed. She spoke less of liberty. She cracked down harder on dissent. She strengthened noble privileges, expanded serfdom, and made sure her control of the empire remained absolute. Some of her former admirers in Europe were disappointed. But Catherine wasn't trying to impress them anymore. She was trying to keep Russia from falling into fire. In many ways, Catherine wore the Enlightenment like a mask, beautiful, thoughtful, even idealistic. But beneath it was a ruler forged in steel. She ruled with charm, yes, but never without calculation. She loved philosophy, but never more than power. And yet, to the people she governed, she was still something remarkable, a woman who had taken a crumbling empire and reshaped it into a cultural force, a foreigner who had become more Russian than the Russians, a queen who had seized her crown and proved she could keep it. By the early 1770s, Catherine had ruled Russia for over a decade. Her reforms had dazzled the West. Her court sparkled with music, poetry, and imported French fashions. And yet, beyond the polished floors of St. Petersburg, unrest was quietly growing. The Russian Empire was enormous, stretching across frozen plains, dense forests, and distant steppes. But what held it together wasn't unity, it was fear. Most of the population still lived in grinding poverty. Serfs, essentially state-owned peasants, were chained to land they didn't own, ruled by nobles they couldn't question. Taxes were harsh, justice was arbitrary, and while Catherine spoke the language of reform, the system she inherited and expanded left millions with little more than survival. Then came Yemelyan Pugachev, a former soldier, a Cossack with a talent for theatrics. Pugachev claimed to be Peter III, Catherine's dead husband, miraculously alive and ready to reclaim the throne. To the peasants, it didn't matter whether they believed it. What mattered was the promised land, freedom, and revenge. The rebellion spread like wildfire. Villages joined him. Serfs rose up against landlords. Some nobles were slaughtered. Entire provinces fell under his shadow. For Catherine, it was a nightmare made real, a peasant uprising fueled by rage, desperation, and centuries of oppression. And worse, it threatened to expose the cracks in her empire to the world. She responded the only way she knew how, with overwhelming force. Troops were dispatched across the countryside. Villages suspected of supporting Pugachev were burned. Rebels were rounded up, tortured, and executed. When Pugachev was finally captured, he was paraded through Moscow in a cage, dirty, defeated. A warning to anyone who might follow his example. The Pugachev rebellion was crushed. But something inside Catherine shifted. She had once dreamed of freeing the serfs, of modernizing Russia's soul, not just its surface. But now she saw what rebellion looked like. Not noble, not orderly, but violent and chaotic. She began to retreat from her idealism. She tightened control over the countryside. She gave more power to the nobility, the very people Enlightenment thinkers had warned against. She expanded serfdom into lands that had never known it before. In the name of stability, she chained the poor even more tightly, and she didn't apologize for it, because Catherine had learned a lesson that many rulers, even today, still struggle with. You can have justice, or you can have order, but rarely both at once. To Europe, she kept up appearances. She still exchanged letters with philosophers, still praised reason and reform. But at home, she had grown harder, more practical. The empress who once admired liberty now banned revolutionary books. After the French Revolution exploded in 1789, she even cracked down on salons and schools that questioned authority. What had once inspired her now terrified her. At the same time, Catherine faced loss on a more personal level. In 1791, her closest political ally and, some whispered, her secret husband Grigory Potemkin died unexpectedly. Their romance had faded years earlier, but their partnership had never weakened. He had helped her conquer Crimea, modernize the army, and expand the empire. His death left a vacuum that no court favorite could truly fill, though Catherine continued to surround herself with younger companions, handsome, loyal, charming. They were no Potemkin. She ruled alone, her court filled with music and marble, but her heart increasingly isolated. And then there was her son, Paul. Catherine never trusted him. She saw in him none of her insight, none of her flexibility. He admired absolute monarchy in the old style, a man of emotion, not reason. Privately, Catherine considered bypassing him altogether, grooming her grandson Alexander to succeed her instead. But fate had other plans. In 1796, Catherine suffered a massive stroke. She died days later, her reforms unfinished, her thoughts unspoken. When Paul took the throne, his first act was to reverse many of her policies. He buried her next to Peter III, the husband she had overthrown, and who may have died at her command. In death, they were reunited. In life, they had never truly been a couple. But history would remember Catherine for what she was, a woman who defied every expectation. She had risen from a minor German princess to one of the longest-ruling monarchs in Russian history. She expanded the empire's borders, modernized its cities, and transformed a backward court into a beacon of culture. And yet, she ruled with steel beneath her silk, with strategy behind her smiles. To some, she was a tyrant, to others, a visionary. But perhaps her truest title was this: survivor. When Catherine the Great passed away in November of 1796, she left behind more than just an empty throne. She left behind an empire transformed. Over her 34-year reign, Russia had grown by more than 200,000 square miles, a staggering figure by any standard. Her armies had pushed deep into the south, claiming Crimea, securing warm water ports along the Black Sea, and opening trade routes that Russia had only dreamed of before. She had carved out pieces of Poland, joined strategic alliances, and reshaped the map of Eastern Europe, all without plunging her country into endless war. But Catherine didn't just redraw borders. She reimagined Russia itself. When she had first arrived as a young German princess, Russia was a land still clinging to medieval customs. Many towns lacked schools. Roads were little more than mud paths. Medicine, literacy, and modern science were luxuries of the elite and rare even then. By the time of her death, that had changed. She had established hundreds of new schools, including some of the first state-funded institutions for girls. She built hospitals, supported the smallpox vaccine, and promoted public health in ways few monarchs had dared. She expanded the role of local government, improved infrastructure, and made education a national conversation, not just an aristocratic pastime.